What if I told you that one of Hollywood's most beloved voices died alone, leaving behind a mysterious house that holds dark secrets about his final years? Scatman Crothers brought joy to millions through his music and movies, but the truth about his last days and the eerie fate of his home will shock you. This is his untold story. From Terre Haute to Harlem Dreams. Most people never imagined that a boy drumming on tin cans in small-town Indiana would one day become one of Hollywood's most beloved voices. But Benjamin Sherman Crothers was never like most people. Born on February 23, 1906, in Terre Haute, Indiana, he entered a world that would test his dreams at every turn. His family knew struggle intimately. The Great Depression hadn't even hit yet, but the Crothers household was already feeling the pinch of poverty that gripped working-class families across America. His father worked whatever jobs he could find, while his mother tried to keep the family together with little more than hope and determination. But young Benjamin had something else burning inside him, an unstoppable love for music. By the time he was 14, Benjamin was already making music his lifeline. He'd set up his makeshift drum kit on street corners around Terre Haute, playing for nickels and dimes from passers-by. Every coin he earned went straight to his family's survival fund. The rhythms he created weren't just entertainment. They were his family's grocery money, their rent money, their ticket to another day. But small-town Indiana couldn't contain the musical fire growing inside him. In the early 1920s, Benjamin made a decision that would change everything. He packed his few belongings and headed east to New York City, chasing the sounds of jazz that were revolutionizing American music. Harlem was calling, and he was ready to answer. The journey from Terre Haute to Harlem wasn't just about miles. It was about transformation. In those smoky jazz clubs and late-night jam sessions, Benjamin discovered something magical. He could sing in a way that made instruments jealous. His voice could dance around melodies, creating sounds that had never been heard before. The other musicians started calling him Scatman because of his incredible ability to sing, that wordless, improvisational vocal style that turned the human voice into a jazz instrument. But being a black entertainer in the 1930s and 40s meant facing walls that seemed impossible to climb. Segregation wasn't just a Southern problem, it was everywhere. Hotels wouldn't house him, restaurants wouldn't serve him, and many venues wouldn't book him, no matter how talented he was. Every opportunity came with conditions, restrictions, and humiliations that white performers never had to face. Yet something about Benjamin's spirit refused to break. His breakthrough finally came when he started performing with major jazz bands, developing a style so unique that audiences couldn't ignore him. The boy who once drummed for grocery money was becoming a legend, though he had no idea that his greatest fame still lay decades ahead. The voice that launched 1,000 smiles. The 1950s brought winds of change to Hollywood, and Scatman Crothers was ready to ride them all the way to stardom. While most jazz musicians stayed in the clubs, Crothers saw something different on the horizon. The movie studios were slowly opening their doors to black actors, and his unique combination of musical talent and natural charisma made him impossible to ignore. His transition from smoky jazz clubs to bright Hollywood sets wasn't easy, but Crothers had something special that directors couldn't resist. His voice wasn't just a sound, it was an experience. Warm, gravelly, and instantly recognizable. It could make audiences laugh, cry, or just feel good about being alive. This vocal magic would become his ticket to Hollywood immortality. The 1970s and 80s became Crothers' golden years on screen. He appeared in dozens of films, always bringing that special spark that made even small roles memorable. But it was his work in The Shining, as the ill-fated chef Dick Hallorann, that really showcased his dramatic range. Few people know that Stanley Kubrick was so impressed with Crothers' professionalism that he rewrote scenes just to give him more screen time. Television became his true kingdom, though. His recurring role as Louis the Garbage Man on Chico and the Man brought him into American living rooms every week. Audiences fell in love with his gentle humor and authentic warmth. The show's success proved that America was ready to embrace black performers in leading roles, and Crothers was helping to pave that path. But perhaps his most surprising success came through voice acting. In 1986, he lent his distinctive voice to Jazz, the Autobot in the Transformers animated movie. Kids who had never heard of jazz music suddenly knew Scatman Crothers' voice better than their own parents did. His catchphrase, "Do it with style," or "Don't bother doing it," became legendary among fans. Behind the cameras, Crothers was building a reputation as one of Hollywood's most professional and kind-hearted performers. Directors loved working with him because he never complained, always knew his lines, and treated everyone on set with respect. Co-stars regularly mentioned how he would mentor young actors and share his decades of experience without expecting anything in return. Jack Nicholson once said that working with Crothers was like getting a masterclass in entertainment from a true gentleman. Even when scripts were terrible or shooting conditions were harsh, Crothers maintained his positive attitude and infectious smile. This professionalism was earning him steady work and good money, but it was also setting him up for the lifestyle that would eventually lead to his downfall. By the early 1980s, Scatman Crothers was living the Hollywood dream, with regular paychecks and a growing bank account that seemed to promise security forever. When the Scatman was rolling in cash, money was flowing like water for Scatman Crothers in the late 1970s, and he was drinking it all in. At the peak of his career, he was pulling in serious cash from multiple sources: television residuals, movie roles, voice acting gigs, and live performances. Industry insiders estimated his net worth had climbed to over $2 million, which was incredible wealth for a character actor in those days. The numbers were staggering. His regular appearances on Chico and the Man alone were bringing in thousands of dollars per episode, plus residuals that kept paying him long after the cameras stopped rolling. Add his movie work, voice acting for cartoons and commercials, and his occasional jazz performances, and Crothers was earning more money than he had ever dreamed possible during those lean years in Terre Haute. With great wealth came great spending. Crothers wasn't the type to hoard his money. He wanted to enjoy every dollar he earned. His Los Angeles home became a showcase of his success, filled with expensive furniture, state-of-the-art entertainment systems, and a music room that would make professional studios jealous. He drove luxury cars, wore custom-tailored suits, and threw parties that became legendary in Hollywood circles. But what really set Crothers apart was his generosity. He couldn't say no to family members who needed help, friends who were struggling, or young musicians who reminded him of his own hungry years. He regularly sent money back to relatives in Indiana, paid for friends' medical bills, and even helped finance other people's business ventures. His kindness was genuine, but it was also expensive. Crothers fancied himself a businessman too. He invested in several restaurants, thinking his fame would draw customers and guarantee success. He bought real estate properties, convinced that Los Angeles land values would keep climbing forever. On paper, these investments looked smart, but Crothers was learning the hard way that business success required different skills than entertainment success. The warning signs were there, even during these prosperous years. Friends noticed that Crothers rarely said no to investment opportunities, especially when they came from people he trusted. He had a tendency to sign contracts without reading them carefully, trusting that his advisors had his best interests at heart. His accountant reportedly tried to warn him about his spending habits, but Crothers believed the good times would last forever. More troubling was his habit of lending money to people who never paid him back. He funded several friends' business ventures that failed spectacularly, and he rarely pursued the debts when people couldn't repay him. His generous nature was becoming a financial liability, though he couldn't see it at the time. The lifestyle he was building required constant income to maintain, and in Hollywood, constant income was never guaranteed. The stage was being set for a financial disaster that would eventually leave him vulnerable and alone. Inside his Los Angeles dream home, the house on Mulholland Drive was more than just a home. It was Scatman Crothers' personal monument to everything he had achieved. Purchased in 1978, At the height of his earning power, this sprawling Los Angeles mansion represented his journey from street corner performer to Hollywood royalty. Every room told the story of a man who had finally made it. Located in one of Los Angeles's most prestigious neighborhoods, the house sat on nearly 2 acres of perfectly manicured grounds. The Spanish-style architecture was impressive enough, but what made it truly special were the personal touches that reflected Crothers' unique personality and passions. Visitors would immediately notice the walls lined with jazz memorabilia, vintage posters from legendary clubs, photographs with famous musicians, and gold records from his various recording projects. The crown jewel of the house was Crothers' music room, a professionally soundproofed space that rivaled the best recording studios in Hollywood. He had spared no expense on the equipment, installing top-of-the-line mixing boards, microphones, and instruments. This wasn't just for show. Crothers regularly used this room to practice, compose, and record music with visiting artists. The room became a creative sanctuary where he could escape from the pressures of his acting career. But the real magic happened in the backyard. Crothers had designed an outdoor entertainment area that became legendary in Hollywood circles. A large patio with built-in barbecue pits could accommodate dozens of guests, while a custom-built stage allowed for impromptu performances under the stars. The swimming pool area was surrounded by comfortable seating where guests could relax between jam sessions. The parties at Crothers' house were the stuff of Hollywood legend. Jack Nicholson, Freddie Prinze, and other stars from Chico and the Man were regular attendees. But the real attractions were the jazz musicians who would show up for unforgettable jam sessions. These weren't formal concerts. They were spontaneous musical celebrations that could last until dawn. Neighbors reported hearing incredible music floating over the hills at all hours of the night. For Crothers, this house represented everything he had worked for. It was proof that a poor kid from Indiana could make it in Hollywood and be accepted by the entertainment elite. The house was his refuge, his creative space, and his way of giving back to the community that had embraced him. However, even during these golden years, there were subtle signs of trouble. The mortgage payments were substantial, and maintaining such a large property was expensive. The constant entertaining, while fun, was also costly. Friends later recalled that Crothers sometimes seemed stressed about money, even while living in luxury. What nobody realized at the time was that this beautiful home would eventually become both a symbol of his success and a burden that would help drag him toward financial ruin. The beginning of the end. By the early 1980s, the phone calls that had once filled Scatman Crothers' days with work opportunities were becoming disturbingly quiet. Hollywood has always been brutal to aging actors, and Crothers was discovering this harsh reality firsthand as he entered his 70s. The industry that had once celebrated his unique talents was now chasing younger faces and fresher voices. The roles that did come his way were smaller, less frequent, and paid significantly less than what he had grown accustomed to during his peak years. Television shows wanted younger actors who could carry series for multiple seasons, and movie studios were investing in action stars and teen heartthrobs. Character actors like Crothers were becoming an endangered species in the changing entertainment landscape. Making matters worse, Crothers was battling health issues that were affecting his greatest asset: his voice. Years of smoking had taken their toll on his lungs, causing breathing problems that made his famous scat singing increasingly difficult. His once powerful voice was becoming raspy and strained, limiting his ability to perform the jazz vocals that had made him famous. Medical treatments were expensive, and his health insurance didn't cover everything. But the most shocking blow came when Crothers finally sat down with his accountant to review his finances. The numbers were devastating. His restaurant investments had failed spectacularly, losing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Real estate deals that had seemed like sure bets were turning into money pits. Worst of all, several people he had trusted with his financial affairs had been skimming money for years, leaving him with far less than he thought he had. The lifestyle he had built during his wealthy years required constant income to maintain. But that income was drying up fast. The mortgage payments on his Mulholland Drive mansion were crushing him. and the cost of maintaining such a large property was eating through his remaining savings. Friends noticed that the legendary parties had stopped, and Crothers seemed increasingly stressed and withdrawn. In 1983, Crothers faced the most heartbreaking decision of his life. He had to sell his beloved dream home. The house that had represented everything he had achieved was now the anchor dragging him toward bankruptcy. The sale was painful but necessary, and he used most of the proceeds to pay off debts and buy a much smaller, modest house in a less expensive neighborhood. The emotional toll of losing his home was devastating. Friends reported that Crothers seemed like a different person after the move. The man who had once been the life of every party was now quiet and often depressed. He continued trying to find work, accepting any role offered to him, but the magic that had once made him special seemed to be fading along with his fortunes. What nobody realized was that this was just the beginning of a downward spiral that would lead to even darker days ahead. Alone in the shadows. The small house on a quiet street in Van Nuys was a world away from the glamorous Mulholland Drive mansion that had once defined Scatman Crothers' success. This modest two-bedroom home, where he would spend his final years, became both his refuge and his prison. Neighbors barely recognized the legendary entertainer who had moved into their working-class neighborhood in 1984. What they did notice was deeply troubling. The man who had once been Hollywood's most social performer was now living like a hermit. Days would pass without anyone seeing him leave the house. When neighbors did spot him, they were shocked by his appearance. He had lost significant weight, his clothes hung loose on his frame, and he moved with the slow, careful steps of someone much older than his years. The reports from concerned neighbors painted a picture of a man in decline. They heard him coughing violently at all hours of the day and night, a harsh, painful sound that echoed through the thin walls. His once powerful voice, when they heard it at all, was now weak and raspy. Some neighbors later said they wished they had knocked on his door to check on him, but Crothers had become so withdrawn that approaching him felt intrusive. Despite his declining health, Crothers was still desperately trying to revive his career. He accepted any work offered to him, no matter how small or poorly paid. Jazz festivals that had once paid him thousands of dollars now got his services for a few hundred. He appeared at tiny clubs and community events, performing for audiences that sometimes numbered in the dozens rather than thousands. The most disturbing aspect of his final years were the strange incidents that neighbors witnessed. They reported hearing loud jazz music played at all hours, often the same songs repeated over and over again. Sometimes the music would stop suddenly, followed by periods of complete silence that lasted for days. When asked about it, Crothers would mumble vague explanations about practicing or working on new material. Even more concerning were the visitors who occasionally showed up at his house. Neighbors described seeing well-dressed men who would arrive in expensive cars, stay for short periods, and leave with Crothers looking visibly upset. These visits often preceded periods when the music would stop completely, and Crothers would seem even more withdrawn than usual. Friends who tried to maintain contact with him reported that he had become paranoid and suspicious. He complained about people trying to take advantage of him financially. Though he was vague about the details, phone calls to old friends became rare, and when he did reach out, conversations were often rambling and confusing. The man who had once brought joy to millions was now trapped in a cycle of isolation, declining health, and mounting desperation. What nobody knew was that his final chapter was about to be written in the most tragic way possible. November 22nd, 1986. The silence from the small Van Nuys house had stretched on for 3 days before a concerned neighbor finally called the police. On the morning of November 22nd, 1986, officers forced their way through the front door and discovered a scene that would haunt everyone involved. Scatman Crothers lay dead in his bedroom, alone, and having clearly suffered through his final hours without anyone to help him. The official cause of death was lung cancer, but the real tragedy was how secretly he had battled this disease. Medical examiners determined that the cancer had been ravaging his body for months, possibly even years. His lungs, once powerful enough to fuel his legendary voice, had been slowly destroyed by decades of smoking and the aggressive disease that he had hidden from everyone who cared about him. What shocked investigators most was the evidence that Crothers had been too proud to seek proper medical treatment, even as his condition became life-threatening. Prescription bottles found in his home revealed that he had been managing his pain with over-the-counter medications and outdated prescriptions. Friends later revealed that he had stopped returning their calls months earlier, apparently determined to face his illness alone, rather than admit he needed help. The funeral arrangements told the story of how far Crothers had fallen from his Hollywood heights. Instead of the elaborate celebration of life that his fame should have warranted, he received a modest service attended by only a handful of people. Many of his former co-stars and friends didn't even know he had died until weeks later, highlighting how isolated he had become in his final years. Perhaps most shocking of all was the revelation of his estate's value at the time of death. The man who had once been worth over $2 million left behind assets totaling less than $50,000. After funeral expenses and outstanding debts were paid, there was almost nothing left. The transformation from wealthy Hollywood star to impoverished recluse was complete and devastating. Immediately after his death, questions began swirling about what had happened to his fortune. Investigators found evidence of numerous financial transactions in his final years, but many of the details remained murky. Some money had clearly been lost to failed investments and generous gifts to friends and family, but other disappearances were harder to explain. The house where he died was found to be behind on mortgage payments, and creditors quickly moved to claim what little remained of his possessions. Personal items that should have gone to family members or museums were instead sold at auction to pay debts. Photographs, musical instruments, and memorabilia from his incredible career were scattered to anonymous bidders. The entertainment industry had lost one of its most beloved figures, but the circumstances of his death raised uncomfortable questions about how Hollywood treats its aging stars and what happens when the spotlight finally fades away. What happened to the dream home? While Scatman Crothers died in poverty in Van Nuys, his former Mulholland Drive mansion began its own tragic descent into decay and mystery. The house that had once hosted legendary Hollywood parties and jazz sessions was about to become one of Los Angeles's most haunting abandoned properties, with a story almost as dark as its former owner's final years. After Crothers sold the house in 1983, it changed hands several times, but each new owner seemed cursed by bad luck. The first buyers, a young Hollywood couple, lasted only 2 years before financial troubles forced them to sell. The next owners, a music producer and his family, moved out abruptly after just 18 months, citing personal reasons they refused to discuss publicly. By the mid-1990s, the house had been empty for years, and nature was beginning to reclaim it. The once manicured grounds became overgrown with weeds and wild vegetation. Windows were broken by vandals or storms, and the roof began leaking, causing water damage throughout the interior. The swimming pool that had once reflected the lights of glamorous parties became a stagnant, algae-covered eyesore. Urban explorers who have managed to get inside the house report finding eerie remnants of its glamorous past scattered throughout the rooms. Old photographs of Crothers with Hollywood stars still hang on water-stained walls. Sheet music from his jazz compositions lies scattered across the floor of what was once his recording studio. A grand piano sits in the main living room, its keys yellowed and many of its strings broken, but still recognizable as the instrument where countless impromptu concerts once took place. The most chilling discoveries are the personal items that suggest the house's decline mirrors Crothers' own tragic story. Medical bills and foreclosure notices from his final years were found stuffed in drawers, as if someone had tried to hide the evidence of his financial collapse. A collection of his gold records, once proudly displayed, now sits tarnished and forgotten in a back bedroom. Local legends have grown around the abandoned mansion over the years. Neighbors report hearing faint jazz music drifting from the empty house at night, particularly on the anniversary of Crothers' death. Some claim to have seen lights moving through the darkened rooms, though the electricity was shut off decades ago. Security guards hired to patrol the property have reported feeling an unexplained presence and hearing what sounds like distant laughter echoing through the empty halls. The house remains trapped in legal limbo, with ownership disputes and unpaid taxes creating a bureaucratic nightmare that has prevented any serious restoration efforts. Various developers have expressed interest in the property over the years, but each potential deal has fallen through under mysterious circumstances. Today, the mansion stands as a crumbling monument to both the heights of success and the depths of tragedy that defined Scatman Crothers' incredible but ultimately heartbreaking life story. The cautionary tale of Scatman Crothers. The tragic story of Scatman Crothers serves as one of Hollywood's most powerful warnings about what happens when fame fades and financial reality crashes down. His journey from millionaire entertainer to isolated, impoverished recluse exposes the dark side of an industry that celebrates stars but often abandons them when they're no longer profitable. When news of Crothers' death finally spread through Hollywood, the entertainment community was shocked by how far he had fallen without anyone noticing. Jack Nicholson, who had worked with him on The Shining, expressed regret that he hadn't stayed in closer contact. Fellow voice actors and jazz musicians organized tribute concerts, but many admitted they felt guilty for not reaching out during his final years. The industry that had once celebrated his talent had simply moved on while he struggled alone. Despite the tragic circumstances of his death, Crothers' artistic legacy continues to inspire new generations of performers. Voice acting schools still use his work as an example of how to bring genuine emotion and personality to animated characters. His influence can be heard in countless animated movies and television shows, where voice actors strive to achieve the same warmth and authenticity that made his performances so memorable. The jazz community has been more proactive in honoring his memory. Several music festivals now feature annual Scatman Crothers tributes, celebrating both his jazz contributions and his pioneering work in bringing jazz music to mainstream audiences through his acting career. Young musicians study his scat singing techniques, keeping that particular art form alive for future generations. In recent years, preservation groups have launched efforts to save his abandoned Mulholland Drive mansion and transform it into a museum dedicated to his life and career. These efforts have faced numerous obstacles, including the complex legal issues surrounding the property and the significant cost of restoration. However, supporters argue that preserving the house would serve as both a celebration of his achievements and a reminder of how quickly success can disappear. The broader lessons from Crothers' story extend far beyond entertainment. His experience highlights the importance of financial literacy, proper estate planning, and maintaining support networks throughout life. Many aging performers now cite his story as motivation for better financial management and staying connected with friends and family even during difficult times. His tale also exposes uncomfortable truths about how society treats its entertainers. We celebrate them when they're successful, but often ignore them when they're struggling. The entertainment industry has slowly begun implementing better support systems for aging performers, partly inspired by tragedies like Crothers' death. Today, Scatman Crothers is remembered both for his incredible contributions to entertainment and as a cautionary reminder that fame and fortune can disappear faster than anyone imagines. His story continues to resonate because it reminds us that behind every entertainer is a human being who deserves dignity and support, regardless of their current success.